What if angels once walked the earth, not as messengers of God, but as rebels? What if their love for humanity broke heaven's laws and gave birth to giants that shook the world? This is the forbidden story of the Watchers, the angels who fell for humanity. What if angels once walked the earth and broke heaven's law for love? What if the beings meant to watch over humanity became their divine posts, descended from the so captivated by what they saw that they abandoned the celestial realm and changed the course of history forever? Tonight, we're diving into one of the most forbidden and controversial stories ever recorded. A story so dangerous that religious A story that challenges everything you authorities buried it for over 1,000 years. The nature of good and evil, and about why thought you knew about angels, about God himself decided to wash the world, became so corrupt that a flood. My name is on this channel because I believe the most profound truths are often the ones they don't want you to discover. And in this video tonight, then you're ready if something drew you to click to hear about the Watchers. The angels, far more human, far more real, who fell not out of pride like Lucifer, but out of something we begin this aidable, and perhaps far more terrifying. Before I journey into forbidden territory, I need you to understand something crucial. What you're about to discover, or religious speculation. This document isn't just ancient mythology or history found in texts that were once considered sacred scripture. Texts that were Genesis, and read alongside the early Jewish Exodus in Christian communities. Texts that were systematized from the canon not because they were false biblical truths that challenge the foundations, but because they reveal if you are ready to one of religious authority. Cover the hiddenies about Genesis chapter 6 to prophecy history that connects the subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Because what the end times hit we're about to reveal will fundamentally change how you understand the spiritual forces that have been shaping human civilization since the beginning. Let's start with what 6 contains, one of the most puzzling things most people know. Genesis chapter, a few verses that are the longest passages in all of Scripture. It has sparked centuries of debate and controversy. The text says this: "When humans were beautiful, and they married earth and daughters were born to them, beings began to increase in number on the sons of God, saw that any of them they chose." Now pause for a moment and really think about what's being described here. The sons of men, sons of God. Not human kings or descendants of Seth. Throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, this term refers phrase here is B'nai Elohim, specifically to divine beings, to angels, to members of God's heavenly council. These weren't human men looking at human women. These were celestial beings, angels who had been assigned to watch over humanity, becoming attracted to mortal women. And not just attracted, but so overwhelmed by desire that they abandoned their heavenly stations and took human wives. The text continues. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when them. They were the heroes of old, the daughters of humans, and had children by the sons of God, who went to men of renown. Heroes of old, men of renown. But the Hebrew word, fallen ones, or those who caused Nephilim, literally means the others to fall. These weren't heroes, they were giants, beings in the way we typically think of heroes. These of extraordinary size and power whose very existence corrupted the natural order of creation. But here's where the biblical account becomes frustratingly brief. Genesis gives us just these few verses and then immediately jumps to God's decisions. What happened in between? Who destroyed the world through the flu exactly? Were these Watchers? How did they descend from heaven? What humanity? For answers to these questions, we have to turn to texts that were deliberately. Chief among these is the Book of Enoch, a detailed account of the Watchers' rebellion, which was once considered sacred scripture by many Jewish and early Christian communities. According to the Watchers, they weren't just any god himself to watch over humanity, but beings assigned by angels. They were a specific group of 200 divine the Erliaza, Errol, Semjakijal, Kok. Their names are recorded: Azaz, generations after Adam and Eve, Abel, Anmaros, Bard, many others. Each division over different aspects of human civilization had specific responsibilities and jurisdiction, but something with lust for them. Their positions in the heavenly realm, observed human women and became consumed, describes how these watchers went wrong. The text, fellow watchers. He said, leader Semjaza proposed a plan to Hizd. I fear agreed to do this deed, and I alone, you will not be, indeed shall have to pay the penalty of a great sin. Think the leader of this rebellion understands what's happening here, even treason. He knew that what they were contemplating was cosmic. There would be consequences that would shake the foundations of heaven and earth. But the desire had become so overwhelming that they were willing to risk everything. The other watchers responded by binding themselves together with mutual oaths and curses. They swore that they would all descend together, that none would abandon the plan, and that they would share equally in whatever punishment might come. This wasn't a moment of weakness, an impulsive decision, or this was a calculated rebellion involving detailed planning and mutual accountability. And then, theoretically, but literally, the Book of Enoch describes their fall. Not Metaph descent from the heavenly realm to Mount Hermon, a location that still exists today on the border between Israel and Lebanon. The very name Hermon means devoted to destruction in Hebrew, and according to this account, it was here that the Watchers first set foot on earth as rebels against heaven. What happened next changed the course of human history forever. The Watchers didn't just take human wives, they began teaching forbidden knowledge to humanity. Azazel taught the making of weapons of war, swords and knives and shields and armor. He taught the art of cosmetics and jewelry, the working of metals and the dyeing of fabrics. Other Watchers taught astrology and divination, the cutting of roots and the properties of plants, the casting of spells and the making of charms. This wasn't education in the modern sense. This was the premature revelation of knowledge that humanity wasn't spiritually mature enough to handle. Think about it. Weapons technology was introduced to a world that hadn't yet learned wisdom. Magical practices are given to people between good and evil. Cosmetics that couldn't distinguish arts that would increase vanity and sensuality than their creator. The Watchers were astronomical knowledge that would lead to worship of the stars, rather than humanity to develop naturally, under essentially fast-tracking human civilization in all the wrong directions. Instead of allowing knowledge upon a spiritual divine guidance, they were forcing an advanced and immature species. The results were catastrophic. But perhaps even more significant were the offspring produced by these unions between angels and human women. The Nephilim weren't just large humans. According to the Book of Enoch, they were giants of extraordinary size, some reaching heights of 300 overed cubits, that 400 feet tall. These beings possessed superhuman strength, supernatural abilities, and an appetite for violence and destruction that terrorized the earth. The text describes how these giants consumed all the crops, the resources that humans had acquired. They ate all the livestock, and when those were exhausted, they turned to consuming humans themselves. They became cannibalistic monsters whose very existence corrupted the natural order of creation, and they weren't sterile hybrids. These Nephilim could reproduce, creating subsequent generations of giants that spread across the earth. The corruption wasn't limited to one generation or one location. It was spreading like a spiritual virus, infecting all of human civilization. Think about the implications of what described here. These weren't just isolates beinged incidents of individual angels making bad choices. This was systematic corruption of the entire human race by supernatural beings who had abandoned their divine calling. The very genetic pool of humanity was being contaminated with something alien, something that didn't belong in the natural, create the stated order. The Book of Enoch describes of the earth during this period in terms that should sound familiar to anyone who's read Genesis chapter 6. The earth was filled with violence. Every imagination of human hearts was only evil continually. But now we understand why. It wasn't just human moral failure. It was supernatural corruption on a scale of human redemption. This, that threatened the very possibility, is why God's response was so just punishment-astic. The flood wasn't for human wickedness. It was a necessary cleansing to remove the genetic and spiritual contamination that threatened to make humanity irredeemable. Only pure unt Noah's family remained corruption that had infected the restainted by the ang of the human race. But here's where the story becomes even more intriguing. According to multiple biblical passages, the Neph chapter 13 describes Silim somehow survived the flood. Numbers, the Israelite spies, reporting giants in the Promised Land. 1 Samuel tells us about Goliath and his brothers, giants who were descendants of the Nephilim. The books of Chronicles mention several battles against giant clans that had to be completely exterminated. How did they survive? Some traditions suggest that the angelic corruption entered the bloodlines of Noah's sons through their wives. Others propose that the fallen watchers continued their activities after the flood, producing new generations of giants. Still others argue that the spiritual contamination was so profound that it could resurface in later generations even from seemingly pure lineages. What's clear from Scripture is that the corruption didn't end with the flood. The same supernatural forces that had corrupted antediluvian civilization continued to operate in post-flood humanity. The Watchers' rebellion had consequences that would echo through all of human history. But here's what makes this story particularly relevant to our current moment. The Book of Enoch doesn't just describe what detailed prophecies about what happened in the distant past. It contains days. And according will happen in the last to these prophecies the same pattern of angelic rebellion and human corruption that characterized the days of Noah will repeat itself in the end times. Jesus himself confirmed this connection when he said, "As will be at it was in the days of Noah, so it the coming of the Son of Man." Did he? What exactly mean by this comparisonness and divine judgment? Or was he referring? Was he just talking about human wick of supernatural corruption to human civilization? The implications to something more specific, something involving the return, are staggering when you consider the technological genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, trans capabilities of our current era, humanism, the BLR consciousness, ending of human and machine knowledge transfer, kind of forbidden, we witnessing the same that characterize the days are supernatural of the Watchers. Technologies and forces once again introducing capabilities that humanity isn't spirits is why understanding the story of the Watchers is so crucial, all mature enough to handle. This for our time. Because IFD repeating, then, we need the patterns of the past are indeed to recognize the signs and dealing with. This to understand what we're really isn't just ancient history. This is prof generation of warfare that will characterize the phonetic preview of the spiritual heaven's law for what they perceived as love, human history. The Watchers broke entirely. Their story that nearly destroyed humanity, but their rebellion unleashed corruption, serves as both a warning and a prophecy of crossing boundaries, revealing the consequences that will repeat as for that were established, showing us the pattern's protection and we approach the end of the age. But we have history. In our next episode, we'll dive deeper into the specific teachings the Watchers gave to humanity and explore how their corrupting influence spread across every aspect of ancient civilization. We'll examine the archaeological evidence for giant races and investigate whether traces of their genetic legacy still exist today. Most importantly, we'll uncover the prophetic connections between the days of Noah and our ancient story might reveal why this be the key to understanding what's coming in the days ahead. The Watchers fell for humanity, but their fall destroyed us all. The question is whether we'll recognize when they emerge again. The same patterns question is whether in our own generation. But there's something even more disturbing hidden. The true extent of the Watchers' corruption of within these ancient texts. Something that reveals human civilization. Because the forbidden knowledge they share isn't just about weapons and cosmic astrology. According to the Book of Enoch, they taught humanity the deepest secrets of creation itself. Barakijal taught the observation of the stars. Kokabel revealed the constellations and their meanings. Ezekiel showed humans the knowledge of clouds and atmospheric phenomena. Erekiel taught the signs of the earth. Shamsiel revealed the signs of the sun. Sariel taught the course of the moon. But here's what's truly chilling about these revelations. These weren't just primitive humans. These were advanced scientific principles that were passed down to early civilization for thousands of years. Astronomy will not be rediscovered by human mechanics. Knowledge of calculations that rival modern precision. Mathematical formulas that describe celestial atmospheric physics suggest an understanding of weather patterns at a molecular level. Think about what this means. The Watchers weren't just teaching humans how to make better tools or prettier jewelry. They were downloading the operating system of creation itself directly into human consciousness. Knowledge that was meant to be discovered gradually through centuries of careful observation and spiritual maturity was being dumped wholesale to handle it. The book into minds that weren't prepared of Jubilees, another ancient text that was once considered canonical, describes how this premature revelation of divine secrets led to unprecedented corruption. Humans began to think of themselves as gods, understanding the consequences. They began experimenting. They started manipulating natural forces without entangling with the fundamental building blocks of life itself. Does any of this sound familiar? Are we perhaps witnessing the same pattern in our own technological age? The rapid acceleration of knowledge that seems to outpace human wisdom? The development of capabilities that we can't fully control or comprehend? The hubris that comes with thinking we can improve upon divine design? But the corruption went deeper than just intellectual pride. According to these forbidden texts, the Watchers also taught what the Book of Enoch calls the resolving of enchantments. This, in manipulating spiritual, wasn't stage magic or simple sleight of hand. This was instruction forces, in accessing dimensions of reality that were meant to remain hidden from human perception. The Watchers showed humans how to communicate with entities from other realms, how to channel supernatural power for personal gain, how to bind spiritual beings to essentially teach humanity black do their will. They are the magic, opening doorways between worlds that should have remained closed. And here's where the story becomes even more terrifying. The offspring just inherit the physical gig of these unions, the Nephilim, and their anger from their ancestors. They inherited spiritual abilities that made them living bridges between the natural and supernatural worlds. They could access angelic power while operating in physical bodies. They became, in essence, demons incarnate. First, Enoch describes these giants as being 300 cubits tall, which would make them nearly 450 feet in height. But more than their size, it was their appetites that terrorized the ancient world. The text states that they devoured everything humans had acquired through their labor. All the crops, all the livestock, all the resources that had taken generations to accumulate. But when those resources were exhausted, the giants turned to consuming humans themselves. And not just consuming their flesh, but drinking their blood like vampires, creatures that existed by devouring their souls. They became spiritual around them. The book draining the life force from everything records that these Nephilim began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish. They weren't just eating these creatures. They were performing abominations with them, creating hybrid monstrosities that violated every boundary of natural creation. Genetic manipulation on a scale that produced creatures so horrific that they could only be described as demonic. Think about the implications of what's being described here. We're not talking about normal human evil or even human depravity taken to extremes. We're talking about supernatural corruption that was literally rewriting the DNA of creation itself. The very fabric of reality was being torn apart by beings who had the power of angels, but the appetites of demons. This is why the flood wasn't just divine punishment for human wickedness. It was cosmic surgery, a necessary amputation to prevent the complete corruption of creation. The entire biosphere had been infected with something alien, something that threatened to make redemption impossible. But here's what most people miss when they read Genesis chapter 6. The text doesn't just say that God decided to destroy humanity because of their wickedness. It says that God regretted that he had made the human heart, which was deeply troubled. The Hebrew word translated as regretted means sorrow. This wasn't divine as nacham, which carries connotations of deep grief and anger in the way we typically understand anger. This was divine heartbreak. God wasn't destroying humanity because he was fed up with them. He was destroying them because he loved them too much to let them be completely corrupted beyond the possibility of redemption. The Book of Enoch reveals that the corruption had reached a point where human children were being born without souls. The angelic DNA had so polluted the human bloodline that some offspring were essentially biological robots, alive but not truly human. They had human bodies but no connection to the divine image that made humanity unique. Can you imagine the grief of a creator watching his beloved creation being systematically destroyed by beings he had trusted to protect it? The Watchers had been given the highest honor possible. Guardianship over God, they had used that position's most precious creation, and very beings to nearly destroy they were meant to protect. But the corruption wasn't limited to the physical realm. According to these ancient texts, the spiritual. The Watchers had taught contamination was even more extensive humans to worship created things rather than the Creator. They had introduced idolatry, demon worship, and spiritual practices that opened doorways to realms of darkness that should have remained sealed. The Book of Jubilees describes how the descendants of the Watchers established the first organized occult practices. Secret societies dedicated to preserving and practicing the forbidden knowledge their angelic ancestors had revealed. Mystery schools that passed down techniques for communicating with fallen angels and accessing supernatural power. These weren't just ancient religious practices that died out with primitive civilizations. According to biblical prophecy, these same spiritual systems would resurface in the last days. The Book of Revelation describes a final spiritual system that will deceive the nations and lead them into worship of the beast. A system that combines advanced technology with ancient occultism in ways that echo the corruption of the pre-flood world. Jesus, the N himself, warned that times would be characterized by deception, so sophisticated that even the elect would be at risk of being deceived. What kind of deception could be so powerful that it would fool people who are walking closely with God? Perhaps the same kind that fooled the antediluvian world. Supernatural power presented as divine revelation, advanced knowledge offered as enlightenment, spiritual experiences that feel real but lead away from truth. The Watchers' rebellion reveals something crucial about the nature of free will and divine sovereignty. These were beings who had perfect knowledge of God's character and will. They lived in His presence and served in His court. They had no excuse for ignorance or confusion about right and wrong, yet they chose rebellion anyway. They saw the beauty of human women and decided that their desires mattered more than their divine calling. They experienced lust and chose to act on it, despite knowing the consequences. They valued their own pleasure more than the well-being of the beings they were meant to protect. This reveals something profound about the nature of love and choice. Even beings with perfect knowledge can choose selfishness. Their own desires matter more than divine purpose over service. Even angels can decide that if heaven can be corrupted by earthly appetites. Even creatures who have experienced the glory heights. The Watchers fell not because they lacked knowledge, or because they were deceived about the nature of good and evil. They fell because they chose themselves over their calling. They chose temporary gods rather than servants of God, a pleasure over eternal purpose. They chose to bed their choice unleashed consequences that nearly destroyed the world. This is the terrifying reality of free will. The freedom to choose self, to choose love, necessarily includes selfhood. The capacity includes the capacity for violence, for heroism. The power to create includes the power to destroy. But here's what makes their rebellion even more tragic. According to the Book of Enoch, the Watchers initially, they argue, resisted the temptation. Their posts themselves about whether to abandon among. Some others tried to convince that the risk was too great and that the consequences would be catastrophic. Acknowledged that he feared Semjaza himself, he alone would bear that what they were contemplating would bring the guilt for such a great sin. He understood judgment, not just on themselves, but on the entire created order. Yet he proposed it anyway because the desire had become overwhelming. This reveals something crucial about the nature of temptation and sin. It rarely begins with a sudden decision to rebel against desire to grow God. It usually starts with small compromises, with allowing we want rather than what we're not, with focusing on what called to do. The What, by Simply Cheers, probably began what it would be like to experience physically noticing human women. Then, I admired their beauty. Then thinking about the relationship. Then they fantasize about abandoning their heavenly duties. Then they plan how they might actually do it. By the time they made the final decision to descend, their hearts, the actual rebellion had already been captured by what they desire for how long. This pattern repeat was just the external manifestation of an internal corruption that had been growing for what throughout human history and in individual human lives. We don't usually fall into major sin through a single moment of weakness. We fall through a series of small choices that gradually erode our resistance, our integrity. The Watcher's story of forbidden desires serves as a warning about the danger of entertaining forbidden desires without allowing our wants to override our calling, of thinking that consequences affecting others. But their rebellion also reveals something beautiful about God's character. When faced with cosmic treason, the creation, God didn't threaten to destroy his to abandon the project. He grieved, but he also acted to preserve what could be saved. He judged, but he also showed his family. The flood, mercy by preserving Noah, wasn't just destruction's commitment to his original purpose for creation. It was purification. It was go-win, his determination to preserve the possibility of redemption, and in the midst of his refusal to let corruption. Even as the waters of judgment, there was promise. The same covenant rose. God was already planning restoration love that grieved over humanity's corruption would ultimately for humanity to be cleansed from sin and restored to a relationship with their Creator. The Watchers fell for humanity, but their fall revealed humanity's need for a different kind of Savior. Not an angel who might be corrupted by earthly desires, but a divine being who could become human without losing his heavenly nature. Not a creature who might choose selfishness over service, but the Son of God himself who would choose sacrifice over self-preservation. The corruption that the Watchers introduced would ultimately fully divine and fully human. The knowledge be healed by one who was both they revealed prematurely would be the power they misused divine wisdom perfectly deemed by one who imbues power with perfect wisdom would be restored by one who wielded infinite love. But before that redemption could come, the effects of their rebellion would continue to ripple through human history. The giants would rise again. The forbidden knowledge would resurface. The same patterns of corruption would repeat in new forms. And according to biblical prophecy, in the last days before Christ's return, corruption that began with the Watchers would see the ultimate fulfillment of the time when the boundaries between natural and supernatural would again be blurred, when humanity would again reach for godlike power, when the earth would again be filled with violence, and every imagination of human hearts would be only evil continually. The question we must ask ourselves is this: are we living in those days right now? Are we witnessing the return of the same spiritual forces that corrupted the pre-flood world? Are we seeing the same patterns of forbidden knowledge being revealed to humanity before we're spiritually mature enough to handle it? The Watchers' rebellion wasn't just ancient history. It was a prophetic preview of the spiritual warfare that would characterize all of human history. Their fall revealed the cosmic forces at work behind human civilization, the supernatural influences that shape earthly events, the spiritual battle between good and evil that determines the destiny of nations and individuals. Understanding their story isn't just about satisfying historical curiosity. It's about recognizing the spiritual dynamics that continue to operate in our world today. It's about learning to discern between divine revelation and demonic deception. It's about understanding that the battle for humanity's soul involves they chose desire over duty, self over service, temporary forces far greater than mere human conflict. The Watchers fell because destroyed the world, but their story also pleasure over eternal purpose. Their choice nearly reveals that even cosmic rebellion cannot ultimately thwart divine purpose. Even the corruption of angels cannot prevent the redemption of humanity. The flood came and cleansed the earth, but the promise remained. The covenant endured. The plan of salvation continued, and one day, the corruption that began with the Watchers' rebellion will be completely healed by the one who conquered both sin and death. But that victory is still future. In the meantime, we live in the aftermath of their fall, dealing with the ongoing effects of their corruption, fighting against the same spiritual forces that they unleashed upon the world. The story of the Watchers reveals why spiritual warfare is real, why the battle for truth is cosmic in scope, and why the stakes of our choices are higher than we usually imagine. Their fall changed everything, but their story also points us toward the ultimate restoration that is coming when all things will be made new, and the corruption they introduced will be forever removed from creation. Next time, we'll explore how the forbidden knowledge the Watchers revealed spread throughout ancient civilization, and examine the archaeological evidence for their continued influence on human culture. We'll investigate whether their genetic legacy survived the flood, and discover how their corruption evolved in the post-diluvian world. Most importantly, we'll uncover the prophetic significance of their story for our current age, and explore whether we're witnessing the final fulfillment of the patterns they established in the days before the flood. The archaeological record speaks volumes about what the ancient civilizations remembered of these events. Scattered across the globe, we find megalithic structures that seem to defy explanation. Baalbek in Lebanon contains stones weighing over 800 tons, moved and positioned with precision that challenges our understanding of ancient engineering capabilities. The platform itself sits on even more massive foundation stones. some estimated at 1,200 tons each. Why is this significant? Because Baalbek sits in the shadow of Mount Hermon, the very location where the Book of Enoch claims the Watchers first descended to earth. Local traditions have preserved stories of giants who built these impossible structures, beings of such size and strength that they could move mountains. But it's not just Lebanon. In Peru, we find the precisely cut stones of Sacsayhuaman, fitted together so perfectly that you can't slide a knife blade between them. In Egypt, the Great Pyramid demonstrates mathematical precision that encodes the value of pi, the golden ratio, and astronomical alignments that shouldn't have been known to Bronze Age civilizations. Easter Island's massive statues seem to stare eternally toward the horizon, their creators vanishing from history without explanation. The Nazca lines stretch across miles of desert, visible only from the air, as if designed for beings who could fly. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dated to over 11,000 years ago, shows sophisticated astronomical knowledge and architectural complexity that predates known civilization by thousands of years. These aren't random anomalies. They're evidence of a lost golden age when knowledge flowed freely between realms, when beings with supernatural capabilities walked among humans and shared secrets that of Enoch reveals that this knowledge calmed civilizations almost overnight. But the book transformed primitive societies into advance at a terrible price. The Watchers did impressive monuments. They introduce it just teach humans how to build technologies oved the earth into a battlefield. Destruction that turn in metal Azazel's instruction. Urgi wasn't just about making farming tools. Hewards, spears, and armor design taught the forging of SD for warfare on a scale the world had never seen. The text describes how human civilization became obsessed with violence and conquest. Cities rose and fell in endless cycles of destruction. The giants roamed the earth as warlords, using their supernatural strength and size to dominate weaker humans. The very innovations that should have elevated humanity instead became instruments of their oppression. But perhaps even more disturbing was the spiritual corruption that accompanied a nation, astrology, and communication with this technological advancement. The Watchers taught div entities. They showed humans how to access supernatural power through rituals and incantations. They revealed the secrets of manipulating reality itself through what wed consciousness techniques. This might recognize today, as advance to the ancient texts, these practices wasn't primitive superstition. According actually worked. Humans gain patterns to heal diseases, the ability to predict the future, to influence weathered their lifespans far beyond natural, and to extend limits. The pre-flood patriarchs lived for centuries, and some traditions suggest this wasn't just divine blessing, but the result of knowledge revealed by the fallen angels. Yet this power corrupted everything it touched. Instead of using their abilities to serve God and care for creation, humans became obsessed with personal gain and selfish ambition. The earth filled with violence, not just because of physical weapons, but because of spiritual warfare on a scale that threatened the very fabric of reality. The Book of Jubilees describes how the descendants of the Watchers established mystery schools to preserve their forbidden knowledge. Secret societies that passed down techniques for accessing supernatural power from generation to generation. These weren't just historical curiosities that died out with ancient civilizations. The biblical prophets warned that these same spiritual systems would resurface in the last days. Daniel chapter 2 describes a final world kingdom in clay, strong in that would be a mixture of iron some ways but fundamentally unstable. Many scholars believe this refers to a time when human technology would be merged with supernatural power doomed to collapse because they're built on Koru, creating systems that appear impressive but are ultimate lifted foundations. The Book of Revelation describes the final Babylon as a spiritual system that deceives the nations through sorceries and enchantments. The Greek word for sorceries is pharmakeia, which refers not just to drug use but to the manipulation of consciousness through chemical and spiritual means. Could this be pointing to our current age of psychoactive medications, mind-altering substances, and technologies that directly interface with human consciousness? Considerach. We have unprecedented access to information, yet how our modern world mirrors the corruption described in the Book of En. We possess technologies that give wisdom seems increasingly rare as godlike power over nature. Yet we use them primarily for entertainment and self-gratification. We can communicate instantly with people developing around the globe, yet we're more isolated and lonely than ever before. We artificial intelligence that may soon surpass human cognitive abilities, genetic engineering that allows us to rewrite the code of life itself, and virtual reality systems that can create entirely alternate realities. We're on the verge of merging human consciousness with machine intelligence, extending human lifespans indefinitely, and perhaps even transferring consciousness between biological and digital systems. Does any of this sound familiar? Are we witnessing the same pattern of premature knowledge revelation that characterized the days of the Watchers? Are supernatural forces once again introducing capabilities that humanity isn't spiritually mature enough to handle? The parallels become even more striking when we examine the current state of human sexuality and family structures. The Watchers' primary sin was abandoning their proper. They left pursue forbidden relationships roles and boundaries to their appointed places in the heavenly hierarchy earthly desires. Today, we see to satisfy family structures. The systematic breakdown of traditional, the blurring of gender roles and ident generations would have considered abominations, itais, and the celebration of sexual practices that previous. We see marriage, reproduction treated as a technological defined, children sexualized, and human process rather than a sacred covenant. The Book of Enoch describes how the corruption spread through intermarriage between the pure and the corrupt bloodlines. It warns that the genetic pollution introduced by the Watchers would resurface in later generations, even among families that seemed untainted. Could this be pointing to spiritual and genetic corruption that lies dormant until activated by environmental triggers? Modern genetics reveals scientists call junk DNA. Genetic, that human DNA contains vast amounts of what sequences that don't seem to code for anything useful. But some researchers suggest this might not be junk at all, but dormant programming waiting for the right conditions to activate. Could some of this genetic material represent the lingering effects of angelic-human hybridization that occurred before the flood? The phenomenon of sudden genetic mutations that produce individuals with extraordinary abilities, whether intellectual, physical, or intuitive, might not be random evolutionary accidents, but the increasing reports of children born with unusual cognitive abilities. Reactivation of ancient programming introduced by the Watchers. The psychic sensitivities, or physical characteristics that don't match their parents, could be evidence that the corruption is resurfacing. But the Book of Enoch also contains hope. It reveals that the Watchers' rebellion, as devastating as it was always part of a larger divine plan. Their corruption served to reveal and the desperate need for redemption that the true nature of evil could only come from God himself. The text describes how the archangel Michael was commissioned to bind the fallen Watchers and cast them into spiritual prisons until the final judgment. Raphael was sent to heal the earth from the corruption they had introduced. Gabriel was given authority over the spiritual realm to prevent future angelic rebellions. And Uriel was appointed to reveal something crucial about the nature of divine sovereignty repentance. This to warn humanity about coming judgment and the need for its purposes. The Watchers thought they were acting and human responsibility. Even cosmic rebellion cannot ultimately thwart go independently, pursuing their own desires against divine will. But their very rebellion served to advance the larger story of redemption at the beginning, Their corruption God had planned from made the need for a Savior obvious. Their contamination of human genetics required divine intervention to preserve a pure lineage through which the Messiah could be born. Their introduction of forbidden knowledge demonstrated that humans needed not just information, but transformation of their hearts and minds. The flood that followed wasn't just punishment for sin, it was cosmic reset, a return to divine order that made and his family were preserved, not because they were perfect, possible the continuation of God's redemptive plan. Noah, but because they maintained genetic and spiritual integrity that allowed them to serve as a new human race. Yet, beginning for the corruption reappeared with the flood. The giants didn't, and the promised by the Watchers' rest practices introduced land. The spiritual faced in Canaanite religion. The same patterns of rebellion and corruption that characterized the pre-flood world continued to manifest throughout human history. This is why the story of the Watchers remains relevant today. It reveals that we're still living in the aftermath of their rebellion. The same spiritual forces that they unleashed continue to operate in our world. The same temptations that led to their fall continue to confront every human being. The choice between serving God and serving self, between divine wisdom and human pride, between eternal purpose and temporary pleasure, these fundamental decisions that the Watchers faced continue to shape individual destinies and collective futures. But here's what makes their story ultimately hopeful, rather than despairing. Their rebellion revealed the depth of the problem, but it also pointed toward the solution. The corruption they introduced required a redeemer who could address not just human moral failure, but the spiritual contamination that threatened to make redemption impossible. That redeemer came both fully God and fully human in the person of Jesus Christ, who was capable of bridging the gap between heaven and earth that the Watchers had corrupted. Where they had used their divine nature to satisfy earthly desires, he used his divine power to serve others. Where they had abandoned their heavenly calling for eternal purpose, the book of temporary pleasure, he embraced suffering Enoch prophecies that in the final judgment, the Watchers will be brought before the throne of God to corruption they introduced will be completely per account for their rebellion, thieged from creation. The giants they produced will be destroyed forever. The forbidden knowledge they revealed will be. But that final judgment is still future redeemed and restored to its proper use. In the meantime, we live in the tension between the corruption they introduced and the redemption that Christ, while looking forward to the ultimate restoration that his promise accomplished. We deal with the ongoing effects of their rebellion. Understanding their story helps us recognize the spiritual forces at work in our world today. It reveals why the battle between good and evil is more than just human conflict. Beings with agendas that span its cosmic warfare involving supernatural millennia. It shows us why disc in an age when deception canonment is so crucial, come wrapped in seemingly beneficial packages. The Watchers fell because they trusted their own judgment more than divine wisdom. They thought they could improve on God's plan by following their own desires. They believed they could handle power without accountability, knowledge without responsibility, pleasure without consequence. Their story serves as a warning for our generation, which faces similar temptations on an unprecedented scale. We have access to power that previous generations could only imagine, knowledge that was once reserved for the highest levels of human achievement, and pleasures that can be accessed instantly with minimal effort. The question we must ask ourselves is whether we're using these gifts according to divine purpose or corrupting them for selfish ends. Are we stewarding the resources we've been given, or consuming them for God's kingdom, or construct our own gratification? Are we building up? The Watchers' rebellioning monuments to our own pride also revealed the unchanging character changed the course of human history, but it of God. His love for humanity was so great that he grieved over our corruption. His justice was so perfect that he couldn't ignore the contamination threatening his creation. His mercy was so abundant that he provided a way of escape even in the midst of judgment. Their rightiest beings in creation fall reminds us that even the Creator, even angels are accountable to their can-choose. Rebellion can be corrupted by selfish desire over righteousness, even supernatural power. But their story also points us toward the one who succeeded where they failed, who remained faithful where they proved treacherous, who used divine power to redeem rather than to corrupt. The Watchers fell for humanity, but their fall revealed humanity's desperate need for a Savior. Their corruption possible by demonstrating that the solution, redemption, necessary. But it also made had to come from outside the created order, from God Himself. Next time, we'll explore how the flood served not just as judgment but as purification, and examine whether Noah's Ark was really about preserving animals or protecting something far more precious, the genetic integrity that would make possible the birth of the Messiah. We'll discover why the giants returned after the flood and investigate the ongoing spiritual warfare between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. Most importantly, we'll uncover how the story of the Watchers connects to the final battle described in Revelation, when the ancient corruption will finally be purged from creation, and God's original purpose for humanity will be completely fulfilled. The end of the story. It was the beginning of angels fell. But their fall was not redemption so magnificent that it would transform even cosmic rebellion into an opportunity for divine glory. But there's something even more chilling about what happened after the flood that most people never consider. If God truly cleansed the earth of all corruption, if every giant was destroyed and every trace of angelic contamination was washed away, then how do we explain what the Israelite spies found when they entered Canaan centuries later? Numbers. Nephilim there? Terrified report. We saw the chapter 13 records there. The descendants of seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same. Anak come from the Nephilim. We 3 describes Og, king of Bashan, who's to them. Deuteronomy chapter iron bed was 13.5 feet long and 6 feet wide. Gath, who stew to Goliath oft, over 9 feet tall and wore armor. First, Samuel chapter 17 introduces weighing 120 uli large humans, the 5 pounds. These weren't just onyas using the exact same term that Hebrew text specifically identifies them as Nephilim, appears in Genesis chapter 6. The corruption had returned. But how? The Book of Jubilees provides that not all the Watchers were bound, a disturbing answer. It reveals immediately after their rebellion. Some remained free after the flood. The text describes how these to continue their work of corrupting humanity, even surviving fallen angels, approached Noah's descendants, and began this another possibility that's even more troubling. First process of contamination all over again, but they're descended to the spirits. In Peter chapter 2 describe how Christ Peter chapter 3 and second who had been to prison and preached to those the days of Noah. This suggests that the fallen, disobedient, and Watchers weren't permanently contained, but were held of spiritual detention awaiting Finald in a kin judgment. Jude, verse 6 confirms this, stating that God has kept the angels holumi darkness until the judgment of the great day, but abandoned their proper dwelling in eternal chains under G doesn't necessarily mean complete to restrictions on immobilization. It could refer the word translated as chains. Watchers retained some ability to influence their activities rather than absolute imprisonment. Think affairs even after the flood, then their corruption could resoar about the implications. If the fallen face whenever conditions were favorable. This would explain why the Old Testament records so many encounters with giants, why pagan religions consistently involved worship of fallen angels, and why supernatural corruption appeared repeatedly throughout biblical history. The prophet Daniel provides crucial insight into this ongoing angelic rebellion. In chapter 10, he describes a spiritual battle that delayed the delivery of his prophet. Gabriel explains that Hetic vision for 21 days. The angel was opposed by the prince of spiritual entity that Wheel Persia, aided authority over that earthly kingdom, Michael, the archangel Ha. This reveals something profound about the nature of earth to intervene before Gabriel could complete his missionly governments and spiritual warfare. Behind every human kingdom stands a spiritual authority that influences its direction and character. Some of these spiritual princes remained loyal to God, but others joined the rebellion that began with the Watchers. Ephesians chapter 6 confirms this multi-dimensional nature of spiritual conflict. Against the authorities, against the cosmic, for we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, forces of evil in the heavenly places, powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual. The Greek words Paul uses here describe a hierarchy of fallen spiritual beings that continues to operate throughout human history. But here is our turn. The Book of Enoch describes us where the story takes an even more sin, how the fallen Watchers taught humanity not just individual sins, but systematic rebellion against divine order. They established what we might call the first organized conspiracy against heaven, complete with secret societies, hidden knowledge, and coordinated corruption. Azazel, according to the text, didn't just teach metallurgy and warfare. He revealed the secrets of deception itself, showing humans how to manipulate truth, how to present evil as good, how to corrupt others while maintaining an appearance of righteousness. He taught the art of propaganda, the techniques of psychological manipulation, the methods of social control, usurping specific aspects of human civilization. Semjaza taught binding Watchers specialized in chorus spells and root cutting and witchcraft. Are essentially the foundations of what would become organized Maros, revealed the resolving of enchantments, the ability to break spiritual bonds and manipulate supernatural forces. Barakijal taught astrology, not as innocent stargazing, but as a system for predicting and influencing future events through communication with cosmic entities. These weren't random teachings given to primitive humans stumbling toward civilization. This doctrination design was systematic and to create a human society that would serve thee. The Watchers were interests of rebellious angels, kingdom on earth, establishing a shadow parallel system of authority that would compete spread through what the ancient with divine government. The corruption texts call the sons of darkness, human blue genetic and spiritual contamination, from lines that carried both their angelic ancestors. These families became the keepers of forbidden knowledge, the practitioners of occult arts, the rulers of earthly kingdoms that served supernatural masters rather than the Creator. Archaeological evidence supports organize of such the existence ancient world. The Thed corruption in megalithic structures we just impressive engineering projects discussed earlier weren't. They were astronomical computers, designed to track celestial movements with supernatural knowledge. Many precision that suggests were aligned to specific star systems that ancient texts identify as the dwelling places of fallen angels. The Sumerian tablets describe the Anunnaki in terms that closely parallel the Watchers of Enoch. These beings descended from heaven, took human wives, taught forbidden arts, and established the first organized civilizations. But their cities weren't built for human flourishing. They were designed as earthly headquarters for a cosmic rebellion that sought to usurp divine authority over creation. The Egyptian pyramids, according to some ancient sources, weren't tombs but resurrection machines, designed to facilitate communication between earthly rulers and their supernatural overlords. The precise mathematical relationships encoded in their construction suggest knowledge of universal constants that shouldn't have been available to Bronze Age civilizations. But perhaps most disturbing are the consistent reports of human sacrifice that characterized these ancient civilizations. The Canaanites burned their children alive in offerings to Moloch. The Carthaginians practiced infant sacrifice on an industrial scale. The Aztecs built their entire society around the systematic slaughter of human beings to appease their gods. These weren't cultural aberrations, or to biblical sources primitive superstitions. They were the logical outcome of spiritual systems established by fallen angels. The Watchers required blood sacrifice because of all life. They had been cut off from the source to only maintain their influence in the earthly realm by consuming the life force of human beings. Leviticus chapter 17 reveals the spiritual significance blood, and I have given it for you on of blood. For the life of the flesh is in the fore, it is the blood that makes atonement by the altar to make atonement for your souls, the life. The fallen angels corrupted this atonement, but for their own sustenance. This divine principle, demanding blood not for explains why virtually every ancient civilization developed elaborate systems of human sacrifice. It wasn't independent cultural evolution. It was the systematic implementation of a spiritual technology revealed by entities that required human death to maintain their earthly power. But the corruption went beyond even physical sacrifice. The Book of Enoch describes how the Watchers taught humans to sacrifice their spiritual integrity, their moral purity, their connection to divine truth. They established systems of initiation that required participants to commit increasingly serious violations of divine law, binding them through guilt and shame to continued service. These mystery schools, as they came to be known, preserved the forbidden knowledge across generations through carefully guarded oral traditions. Initiates learned techniques for accessing supernatural price was their own spiritual destruction power, but they gained earthly influence in the process. The biblical but lost their souls prophets consistently warned against these systems. Isaiah chapter 8 specifically forbids consultation with mediums and spiritists. You to consult mediums and spiritists when someone tells who whisper and mutter, should not a people inquire of their God? Why consult the dead on behalf of the living? The Hebrew word for whisper here suggests the kind of secret hidden communication. Exactly alt practices the Watchers had Deuteronomy chapter 18 established, provides an even more comprehensive warning. Let no one be found among you who sacrifices their son or daughter in the fire, who practices divination or sorcery, witchcraft, or casts and interprets omens, engages in spiritist or who consults theals, or who is a medium or to the Lord, dead. Anyone who does these things is detestable. Notice how specific these prohibitions are. They were interstition. They were precise general warnings against sub-descriptions of practices that the Watchers had taught, iding harm to humanity. God wasn't formless cultural traditions. He was protecting his people from spiritual systems designed to corrupt and destroy them. But here's what history, the same spiritual forces that establish makes this relevant to our current moment in these ancient systems of the old civil corruption didn't disappear when prophesies fell. According to biblical, been working throughout history to reestablish their earthly kingdom, and they will achieve unprecedented success in the last, the final manifest. Thessalonians chapter 2 describes days. Secondation of this rebellion. The coming of the lawless one will be in accordance with how Satan works. He will use all sorts of displays of power through signs and wonders that serve the lie, and all the ways that wickedness deceives those, the Greek word for who are perishing. Displays of power is energeia, which refers to supernatural, isn't mere activity that produces observable results. this rickery, or psychological manipulation. This is genuine supernatural power that will convince even sophisticated people that they're witnessing divine intervention. But notice that the fundamental lie that Satan has this power serves the lie. What has been promoting since the Garden of Eden? That we can determine good and evil for ourselves, that we can access humans, can become like God without submitting to go, then through relationship with our Creator. The Watchers' divine knowledge and power through our own efforts rathered humans' godlike knowledge, this lie on a global scale. They offer rebellion was the first systematic attempt to implement and power, but the price was abandonment of divine authority. They promised elevation but delivered corruption. They claimed to be liberating forces that demanded increasingly humanity, but actually enslaved it to spiritual terrible sacrifices. Revelation chapter 13 describes how this pattern will reach its ultimate fulfillment in the last days. A political leader will emerge who derives his authority from the dragon, the same spiritual entity that originally inspired the Watchers' rebellion. He will perform, calling fire down from heaven in great signs and wonders, event by a religious leader who establish full view of the people. But more significantly, he will be accompanied as a global spiritual system that requires worship of the beast. Everyone will be forced to receive a mark on their right hand or forehead, and no one will be able to buy or sell without this mark. Think about what this means in light of the Watcher's story. The same spiritual forces that once corrupted humanity through forbidden knowledge and supernatural power will achieve their ultimate goal. A global system that forces every human being to choose between worship of God and participation in earthly society. But there's something even more disturbing hidden in the prophetic texts. Daniel chapter 2 describes the final world kingdom as a mixture but fundamentally unstable, because the components of iron and clay, strong in some ways, don't naturally bond together. Many scholars believe supernatural power, creating systems that appear impressive, but are ultimately, this refers to a merger of human technology with current technological trajectory, we doomed to collapse. Could this be describing our abilities? We're creating genetic or developing artificial intelligence that may soon surpass human cognitive engineering techniques that allow us to rewrite the code of life itself. We're building virtual distinguishable from physical experience reality systems that can create entirely alternate realities in. But we're also witnessing unprecedented interest in occult practices, supernatural phenomena, and communication with non-human entities. Ancient mystery school teachings are being repackaged as modern spirituality. Practices that biblical texts identify as communication with fallen angels are being promoted as personal development and consciousness between technology and spirituality, our BL expansion. The boundary surring in ways that echo the corruption described in the Book of Enoch. We're seeing the same pattern of premature knowledge revelation, the same promise of godlike power, the same seductive offer of transcending human limitations through hidden phase of the rebellion, that is whether we're witnessing the final wisdom. The question we must ask ourselves began with the Watchers. Are we seeing the convergence of advanced technology with ancient occultism that will produce the deceptive signs and wonders prophesied for the end times? The Book of Enoch provides a chilling preview of how this story ends. It describes a final judgment when all the corruption introduced by the Watchers will be purged from creation. The giants will be angels, will be cast into eternal destroyed forever. The fallen renewed, but at fire. The earth itself will be cleansed, and also reveals that this judgment-wilception, when the corruption reaches, be preceded by a time of unprecedented its ultimate expression, and threatens to deceive even, go one final attempt to usurp divine authority over its elect. The same spiritual forces that once corrupted the pre-flood world will make creation. Yet the text also contains hope. It prophesies that in the midst of this final corruption, God will raise up witnesses who maintain their faithfulness despite it, through which divine will serve as a rem, overwhelming pressure to conform. These faithful ones, watchers as in truth is preserved, and through which the final restoration becomes possible. The story of that just ancient history, its prophetic preview of the end of spiritual battle that will character the age. Their at work behind rebellion revealed the cosmic forces human civilization. Their corruption demonstrated the consequences of abandoning divine authority for forbidden knowledge. Their judgment purification that will restore creation to its original purpose points toward the final. Understanding their story helps us recognize the spiritual dynamics. Discernment is so crucial in an age when supernatural de-operating in our current moment. It reveals why discfulness to divine truth matters more than accesception can appear as technological advancement. It shows us why faith to hidden knowledge or supernatural power, the Watchers' purpose, forbidden pleasure over divine calling, earth fell because they chose immediate gratification over eternal, unleashed corruption that nearly destroyed creation itself, by influence over heavenly authority. Their choice, but their fall also revealed something beautiful about God's character. Even cosmic rebellion cannot ultimately thwart divine love. Even angelic corruption cannot prevent human redemption. Even deception cannot overcome truth most sophisticated to spoken in love by those who remain faithful to their Creator. The flood came and cleansed the earth, but the promise remained. The corruption returned, but so did the hope of ultimate restoration. The giants rose again, but so did the champions than earthly power. Next, of faith who trusted in divine rather time, we'll examine how the flood served not just as judgment, but as a prophetic symbol of the final purification described in Revelation. We'll explore why the ark wasn't just about saving animals, but about preserving the genetic and spiritual integrity necessary for the Messiah's birth. We'll discover how Noah's family became the bridge between the corrupt, predeemed, post-flood creation, flood world, and the Most importantly, we'll uncover how the patterns established in the days of Noah point toward the ultimate restoration when the corruption introduced by the Watchers will be forever removed, and God's original purpose for creation will be completely fulfilled. The angels fell for what they thought was love, but their fall revealed the true nature of divine love. A love so pure that it will not tolerate corruption, so just that it must judge rebellion, so merciful that it provides redemption even in the midst of judgment, and so powerful that it can transform even cosmic treason into an opportunity for eternal glory. But there's something even more disturbing about this story that brings us face to face with our own moment in history. Because if we're truly living in the days that Jesus compared to the time of Noah, then we need to understand what made those days so uniquely corrupt that God Himself regretted creating humanity. The Book of Enoch reveals that the corruption wasn't just moral or spiritual. It was biological. The text describes how the union between Watchers and human women produced offspring that were fundamentally different from anything God had created. These weren't just large humans. They were hybrid beings that carried both earthly and celestial genetic material. Think about the implications of this. The Nephilim possessed human bodies but angelic consciousness. They had mortal flesh but supernatural abilities. They could interact with both physical and spiritual realms in ways that pure humans never could. They were, in essence, living bridges between dimensions that separate. But here's what makes God had intentionally kept this even more unsettling. According to multiple ancient sources, the Nephilim retained memories from their angelic fathers. They possessed knowledge of heavenly realms, understanding of cosmic principles, and awareness of future events that no human should have had access to. They were born with information downloads that would have taken human civilization centuries to discover through natural means. The Book of Jasher, another ancient text referenced in Joshua chapter 10 and 2 Samuel chapter 1, describes how these hybrid beings used their supernatural knowledge to establish the first global civilization. They built cities that defied natural law, created technologies that manipulated the fundamental forces of creation, and developed communication networks that spanned continents. But their greatest achievement was also their most terrible. They learned how to manipulate human genetics itself. The text describes how they began experimenting with the building blocks of life, creating new species that had never existed before. They merged human DNA with animal characteristics, producing creatures so abominable that they could only be described as monsters. Genesis chapter 6, verse 12 provides a crucial detail that most people overlook. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways. The Hebrew word for corrupted here is shakath, which doesn't just mean moral failure. It means genetic pollution, biological contamination, the fundamental alteration of original design. This suggests that by human genetics had become so rare, the time of the flood, pure, that only Noah's family retained the original Elic human hybridization that the divine blueprint. Everyone else had been contaminated by the Ang Watchers had introduced. The flood wasn't just judgment for sin, it was genetic rescue, preserving the only remaining bloodline through which the promised Messiah could eventually be born. But here's where the story becomes prophetically significant for our current age. We're living in the first generation since Noahulate human genetics on a global scale. Weekhand's time that possesses the technological capability to edit DNA sequences, create human-animal hybrids, and merge biological systems with artificial intelligence in ways that would have seemed like magic to previous generations. CRISPR gene editing technology allows us to rewrite genetic code with precision that surpasses anything found in nature. Scientists are creating chimeras, creatures that combine human cells with animal tissue. Researchers are developing brain-computer interfaces that could merge human consciousness with artificial intelligence. We really alter what it means to be human. Are on the verge of technologies that could fundamentally witnessing the return of the same corrupting influences that characterized the days of Noah? Are spiritual forces once again introducing capabilities that humanity isn't mature enough to handle wisely? The parallels become even more striking when we consider the current obsession with transhumanism, the belief that we can and should transcend biological limitations through technology. The ancient promise of the serpent in Eden was, "You will be like God." The Watchers offered humanity divine knowledge and power through forbidden unions. Today's transhumanist movement promises to make us godlike through genetic enhancement, artificial intelligence augmentation, and consciousness uploading. The fundamental temptation remains the same across millennia. But the Book of Enoch reveals something on pre-flood civilization. These hybrid beings did an even more disturbing about the Nephilim's influence at just corrupt human genetics. They corrupted human worship. The text describes how they established themselves as gods, demanding worship from the humans they dominated. They created the first organized religious systems based not on truth, but on D of the dead. Nephilim became demonception. First, Enoch chapter 15 describes how the spirits' affairs even after their physical bodies were destroyed. This explains unclean spirits that continue to influence the origin of the demonic forces that plague humanity throughout biblical history. Every demon that Jesus cast out, every unclean spirit that tormented God's people, every evil influence that corrupts human civilization can be traced back to the Watchers' rebellion. This understanding transforms how we read the rest of Scripture. When Jesus encountered demons, he wasn't the spiritual offspring of the Watchers at dealing with abstract evil forces. He was confront beings that retained memories of their rebellion against heaven and harbored intense hatred for humanity because of God's love for us. The Mark. Chapter 5 provides a crucial Racine demoniac in insight into the nature of these entities. When Jesus asked the demon's name, it replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." The Greek word legion of demonic spirits refers to a Roman military unit of approximately 6,000 soldiers. This suggests that thousands inhabiting a single human being. But notice what happened when Jesus cast them out. The demons begged not to be sent out of the area they didn't want to be banned. The Greek phrase suggested from the earthly realm entirely. They were desperate to maintain some form of physical presence, some connection to the material world they had corrupted through their original rebellion. This reveals something crucial about the ongoing spiritual God's people randomly. Their fighting warfare described throughout Scripture. The demons aren't just opposing their angelic fathers once possessed. They're working to re-establish the conditions that exist to regain the earthly dominion that before the flood, when hybrid beings ruled the earth and humanity served supernatural masters rather than their creator. The prophet Daniel provides additional insight into this cosmic. He describes a 20 conflict. In chapter 10, one-day spiritual battle that prevented the delivery of his prophetic vision. The angel Gabriel explained that he was opposed by the Prince of Persia, a spiritual entity that wielded authority over that earthly kingdom. This reveals the multidimensional nature of human history. Behind every earthly government that influences its character stands a spiritual authority and direction. Some of these princes remain, others join with the Watchers. World, the rebellion that began loyal to God, but history isn't just about human politics and economics. It's about the ongoing conflict between loyal and rebellious spiritual forces, competing for influence over human civilization. Ephesians chapter 6 confirms this understanding. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. The Greek terminology Paul uses describes a hierarchy of fallen beings that continues to operate throughout history. But here's what makes this relevant to our current moment. The same spiritual forces that corrupted pre-flood civilization through the Watchers are working to achieve their ultimate goal in Revelation chapter 12, our generation. Desperate attempt to prevent God's plan of redemption from reaching describes their final text reveals that these fallen entities know completion. Their time is short. They understand that Christ's victory on the cross sealed their ultimate defeat. But they're determined to corrupt as many humans as possible before their final judgment arrives. They're working to recreate the conditions that existed before the flood, when the earth was so corrupted that God regretted creating humanity. This is why understanding the story of the Watchers is so crucial for our time. We're not just witnessing random technological advancement or cultural change. We're seeing the systematic implementation of the same corrupting influences that nearly destroyed humanity before the flood. The same promises of godlike power, the same blurring of natural boundaries, the same rebellion against divine authority. But the Book of Enoch also contains hope. It reveals that God's plan of redemption was established before the foundation of the world, taking into account even cosmic rebellion. The Watchers' corruption served too of divine intervention. Their rebellion demonstrated that even perfect reveal the depth of the problem, and the necessity beings with complete knowledge could choose selfishness over service. This makes the incarnate human. He faced the same temptations that causation even more remarkable. When Christ became the Watchers to fall, he experienced physical desires, emotional attachments, and the appeal of earthly power. But where they chose self-gratification over divine calling, he chose obedience unto death. Where they used their supernatural abilities for personal gain, he employed divine power exclusively for others' benefit. The temptation account in Matthew chapter 4 shows Jesus confronting the same fundamental choices that led to the Watchers' rebellion. Satan offered him immediate gratification of physical needs, spectacular displays of supernatural power, and authority over earthly kingdoms. Each temptation echoed the appeals that had seduced the fallen angels. But Jesus' responses revealed a completely different approach to divine power. Instead of using his abilities to satisfy personal desires, he submitted to the Father's will. Instead of demanding worship for his supernatural demonstrations, he consistently pointed people toward God. Instead of establishing an earthly kingdom based on supernatural dominance, he served others while Jesus could be even unto death. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 15, where called the last Adam in the first, Adam failed in the wilderness. Where the paradise, Jesus succeeded in calling through selfish desire, watchers corrupted their divine, Jesus fulfilled his divine mission through perfect love. Where fallen angels used supernatural power to dominate humanity, the Son of God employed infinite power to redeem humanity. The Book of Enoch, proof of the corruption introduced by the Watseys that the final judgment will completely purge creationtures. The hybrid beings they produced will be destroyed forever. The forbidden knowledge they revealed will be redeemed and restored to its proper use. The spiritual contamination they spread will be cleansed by divine fire. But that judgment will be preceded by a final manifestation of their corrupting influence. The same patterns that characterize the days of Noah will reach their ultimate expression in the last days before Christ's return. Advanced technology will merge with ancient occultism. Genetic manipulation will blur the boundaries of human identity. Supernatural deception will present itself as scientific advancement. Yet, in the midst of this final corruption, God will preserve a remnant who maintain their faithfulness despite overwhelming pressure to conform. These faithful ones will can choose obedience over rebellion, service as witnesses to divine truth, and living proof that humans over selfishness, eternal purpose over temporal pleasure. The story of the Watchers reveals that we're part of a cosmic drama that began before human history and will culminate beyond human time. Our individual choices matter not just for our personal destinies, but for the outcome of a spiritual war that spans dimensions. Every decision to choose God's way over our own desires strikes a blow against the same rebellion that began with the fallen angels. Understanding this cosmic context transforms how we approach daily life. We're not just making routine decisions about career, relationships, and personal goals. We're participating in the ongoing battle between good and evil, truth and deception, divine authority and spiritual rebellion. Our faithfulness matters in ways that extend far beyond our individual circumstances. The Watchers fell because they valued immediate gratification over eternal purpose. They chose earthly pleasure over heavenly calling. They trusted their own judgment more than divine wisdom. Their story serves as both warning and encouragement, revealing the consequences of rebellion while pointing toward the possibility of redemption. But their rebellion also revealed something beautiful about God's character. Even cosmic treason cannot ultimately thwart divine love. Even angelic corruption cannot prevent human restoration. Even the most sophisticated deception cannot overcome truth spoken by those who remain faithful to their Creator. The same God who grieved over the corruption of Noah's time continues to grieve over human rebellion today. The same love that preserved a remnant through the flood continues to offer salvation to all who will receive it. The same power that cleansed the earth through judgment will ultimately restore creation through redemption. Next time, we'll explore how Noah's Ark served not just as a rescue vessel, but as a prophetic symbol of salvation. we'll discover why the flood narrative contains precise instructions for the ark's construction, and examine how every detail points toward Christ's redemptive work. We'll uncover the hidden meaning behind the animals that were preserved, and investigate whether the ark contained something even more precious than biological diversity. Most importantly, we'll reveal how the story of the flood connects to the final restoration described in Revelation, when the corruption introduced by the Watchers will be forever removed, and God's original purpose for creation will be completely fulfilled. Because the waters of judgment that destroyed the old world point toward the fire of purification that will birth the new heaven and new earth. The Watchers fell for humanity, but their fall revealed humanity's desperate need for a Savior who could succeed where they failed, remain faithful where they proved treacherous, and use divine power to redeem rather than corrupt. That Savior came, conquered sin and death, and will return to complete the restoration that began with his first coming. The question that remains is whether we'll be found faithful when that day arrives, whether we'll be among those who maintained their allegiance to truth in the midst of cosmic deception, whether we'll be part of the remnant that serves as bridges between the corruption of this age and the purity of the age to come. The question we must grapple with is this: what does the story of the Watchers ultimately reveal about the nature of free will itself? Because when we examine their rebellion, we're not just looking at ancient mythology or cautionary tales. We're confronting the most fundamental questions about choice, consequence, and the terrifying reality of genuine freedom. Think about what the Watchers possessed before their fall: perfect knowledge of God's character and will, direct access to divine presence, complete understanding of right and wrong, intimate awareness of the consequences their choices would bring. They weren't operating from ignorance, confusion, or incomplete information. They had everything necessary to make the right decision, yet they chose rebellion anyway. This reveals something profound and unsettling about the nature of moral choice. Even beings with perfect knowledge can choose evil. Even creatures with complete understanding can prefer selfishness over service. Even angels who have experienced the glory of heaven can decide that their own desires matter more than divine purpose. The Book of Enoch makes this abundantly clear. Semjaza, the leader of the Watchers, explicitly acknowledged that what they were planning was cosmic treason. He understood the magnitude of the sin they were about to commit. He recognized that judgment would follow. Yet he proposed the plan anyway because the desire had become overwhelming. This challenges every excuse we make for human moral failure. We can't blame our rebellion on lack of information because the Watchers had perfect knowledge. We can't claim ignorance of consequences because they understood exactly what would happen. We can't argue that we're victims of circumstances because they were operating from positions of ultimate privilege and authority. The Watchers' fall reveals that at its core, sin isn't about knowledge or circumstances or external pressures. Sin is about choice, the fundamental decision to place above divine wisdom. This choice remains available: our own will above divine will, our own desires above divine purpose, our own judgment even to beings with perfect knowledge, unlimited power, and direct access to God's presence. But here's what makes their rebellion even more tragic. The text reveals that they initially resisted the temptation. They argued among themselves about whether to proceed. Some tried to convince others that the risk was too great. There was a moment when they could have chosen differently, when they could have turned back from the path that would lead to cosmic destruction. Yet they bound themselves together with mutual oaths and curses. They made their rebellion a collective decision, sharing accountability for what they knew would be catastrophic consequences. This wasn't a moment of weakness or an impulsive mistake. This was calculated, deliberate, coordinated defiance of divine authority. This pattern reveals something crucial about how moral corruption spreads. It rarely begins with dramatic rebellion. It usually starts with small compromises, with gradual erosion of boundaries, with incremental choices that seem managed toward greater corruption. The Wattable individually but create momentumtures probably began by simply admiring human women, then fantasizing about relationships with them, then discussing the possibility with other angels, then planning how they might abandon their posts. By the time they made the final decision to descend, their hearts had already been captured by desire that had grown unchecked for who knows how long. This is the pattern we see repeated throughout human history and in individual human lives. We don't usually fall into major sin through a single dramatic choice. We fall through a series of small decisions that gradually compromise our integrity and weaken our resistance to temptation. But the Watcher's story also reveals something beautiful about God's character that often gets overlooked in discussions of judgment and divine wrath. Even when faced with cosmic rebellion that threatened to destroy His creation, God didn't abandon the project. He grieved, but He also acted to preserve what could be saved. The Hebrew text in Genesis chapter 6 is crucial here. When it says that God regretted making humanity, the word used is nacham, which carries deep emotional content. This isn't divine anger in the way we typically understand anger. This is divine heartbreak. God wasn't destroying humanity because He was fed up with them. He was destroying them because He loved them too much to let them be completely corrupted beyond redemption. Think about what this means. The flood wasn't primarily about punishment. It was about purification. It was about preserving the possibility of redemption by removing the corruption in order to save the world. This reveals something profound about divine that threatened to make salvation impossible. God destroyed the world be addressed because love cannot tolerate what justice and mercy working together. Justice demands that corruption destroys the beloved. Butive purpose rather than merely punitive function. The preservation mercy ensures that judgment serves redemptive Noah's family wasn't random divine favoritism. The text specifically describes Noah as perfect in his generations, using language that suggests both genetic and spiritual integrity. He and his family represented the last remaining bloodline that hadn't been contaminated by the angelic human hybridization that had corrupted the rest of humanity. This means the flood was actually an act of divine mercy, preserving the genetic and spiritual purity necessary for the eventual birth of the Messiah. Without this preservation, the promise given in Genesis chapter 3 about the seed of the woman crushing the serpent's head couldn't have been fulfilled. But here's where the story takes on prophetic significance that extends far beyond ancient history. Jesus Himself connected the days of Noah to the end times when He said in Matthew chapter 24, "As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man." This wasn'tness. This was a specific just a general comparison about human wicked connection to the patterns that would characterize the final generation. What exactly characterized the days of Noah that will be repeated before Christ's return? According to the Book of Enoch and related texts, it was the blurring of boundaries between natural and supernatural realms, the introduction of forbidden knowledge that humanity wasn't spiritually mature enough to handle, the corruption of human genetics through supernatural interference, the emergence of hybrid beings that possessed both earthly and heavenly characteristics. Are we witnessing these same patterns in our current generation? Consider the rapid advancement of technologies that were unimaginable just decades ago. Genetic engineering that allows us to rewrite the code of life itself. Artificial intelligence that may soon surpass human cognitive abilities. Virtual reality systems that can create alternate realities indistinguishable from physical experience. But even more significantly, consider the growing interest in supernatural phenomena, communication with non-human entities, and the merger of technology with occult practices. Ancient mystery school teachings are being repackaged as modern spirituality. Practices that biblical texts identify as communication with fallen angels are being promoted as consciousness expansion and personal development. The same promise that the serpent made in Eden, "You will be like God," is being offered today through technological enhancement, genetic modification, and spiritual practices that claim to unlock human potential. The fundamental temptation remains the same across millennia: the suggestion that we can achieve godlike power and knowledge apart from submission to God. But the Book of Enoch also reveals something else about the end times that should give us hope. It prophesies that in the midst of unprecedented deception and corruption, God will preserve a remnant who maintain their faithfulness despite overwhelming pressure to conform. These faithful ones will serve as witnesses to divine truth and living proof that humans can choose obedience over rebellion. The text describes these end-time believers in terms that echo the description of Noah's family. They will be perfect in their generations, maintaining spiritual and moral integrity while the world around them descends into chaos. They will preserve the truth when lies become culturally dominant. They will remain faithful when unfaithfulness becomes fashionable. This is why understanding the story of the Watchers is so crucial for our generation. We're not just reading ancient history. We're studying a prophetic preview of the spiritual forces and moral choices that will characterize the final chapter of human history before Christ's return. The same entities that corrupted the pre-flood world through the Watchers are working to achieve their ultimate goal in our generation. They know their time is short. They understand that Christ's victory on the cross sealed their ultimate defeat. But they're determined to corrupt as many humans as possible before their final judgment arrives. This is why the battle for truth has become so intense in our current moment. Why deception has become so sophisticated. Why the pressure to compromise has become so overwhelming. We're witnessing the final phase of a cosmic rebellion that began with the Watchers and will culminate in the events described in Revelation. But here's what gives us confidence in the midst of this spiritual warfare. The same God who preserved Noah's family through the flood will preserve his people through the final tribulation. The same love that grieved over human corruption will ultimately triumph over every form of rebellion. The same power that cleansed the earth through judgment will restore creation through redemption. The story of the Watchers reveals that we're part of a cosmic drama that extends far beyond our individual lives and circumstances. Our choices matter not just for our personal destinies, but for the outcome of a spiritual war that spans dimensions and ages. Every decision to choose God's way over our own desires strikes a blow against the same rebellion that began with the fallen angels. This understanding transforms how we approach the challenges of daily life. We're not just dealing with ordinary human problems. We're participating in the ongoing battle between good and evil, truth and deception, divine authority and spiritual rebellion. Our faithfulness has cosmic significance that extends far beyond our immediate circumstances. The Watchers fell because they trusted their own judgment more than divine wisdom. They thought they could improve on God's plan by following their own desires. They believed they could handle power without accountability, knowledge without responsibility, pleasure without consequence. Their story serves as both warning and encouragement. Warning because it reveals how even the mightiest beings can be corrupted by selfish desire. Encouragement because it points toward the one who succeeded where they failed, who remained faithful where they proved treacherous, who used divine power to redeem rather than corrupt. Jesus faced the same fundamental temptations that caused the Watchers to fall: the appeal of immediate gratification, the attraction of earthly power, the seduction of supernatural display. But where they chose selfishness, he chose sacrifice. Where they abandoned their calling, he fulfilled his mission. Where they corrupted their divine nature, he perfectly expressed divine love. This is why the Incarnation was so necessary and so remarkable. Only one who was both fully God and fully human could succeed where angels had failed. Only one who possessed divine power but willingly submitted to human limitations could demonstrate what perfect obedience looks like. Only one who experienced temptation but never yielded could serve as our representative and redeemer. The Book of Enoch prophesies that the final judgment will completely purge creation of all the corruption introduced by the Watchers. The hybrid beings they produced will be destroyed forever. The forbidden knowledge they revealed will be redeemed and restored to proper use. The spiritual contamination they spread will be cleansed by divine fire. But that judgment will also be the beginning of ultimate restoration. The same God who grieved over corruption will rejoice over redemption. The same love that preserved a remnant through the flood will gather all the faithful into eternal fellowship. The same power that cleansed the earth through water will create new heavens and a new earth through fire. The corruption that began with the Watchers will finally be completely and permanently removed. The rebellion that has plagued creation since their fall will be forever ended. The cosmic temple that they defiled will be restored to perfect holiness. The relationship between heaven and earth that they corrupted will be healed beyond the possibility of future violation. Until that day arrives, we live in the tension between the corruption they introduced and the redemption Christ accomplished. We deal with the ongoing effects of their rebellion while looking forward to the complete restoration that is promised. We participate in spiritual warfare while trusting in ultimate victory. But we don't fight this battle alone or in our own strength. The same Spirit that raised Christ from the dead dwells within every believer. The same power that will ultimately triumph over all rebellion is available to help us choose obedience in our daily decisions. The same love that will restore all things sustains us through every trial and temptation. The Watchers fell for what they perceived as love, but their fall revealed the true nature of divine love. Love that will not tolerate corruption because it destroys the beloved. Love that provides redemption even in the midst of judgment. Love that preserves hope even in the darkest circumstances. Love that ultimately transforms even cosmic rebellion into an opportunity for eternal glory. Their story isn't just about them choices, it's about us. It's about the we face, the temptations we encounter, the spiritual forces we wrestle against. It's about the cosmic significance of individual faithfulness and the eternal consequences of moral decisions that seem merely personal. Most importantly, it's about the hope that emerges from even the darkest rebellion. The hope that corruption can be cleansed, that rebellion can be forgiven, that even the worst spiritual contamination can be purified by divine grace. But that hope comes with responsibility. The same freedom that allowed the Watchers to choose rebellion allows us to choose faithfulness. The same moral agency that enabled their corruption enables our obedience. The same capacity for choice that led to their fall can lead to our redemption. The question that remains is what we'll do with this freedom. Will we learn from their example and choose differently? Will we recognize the spiritual forces at work in our generation and respond with wisdom rather than folly? Will we be among those who maintain their faithfulness when the final deception reaches its climax? The story of the Watchers reveals that even cosmic rebellion serves divine purpose in ways that rebellious beings never intended. Their corruption made the need for redemption obvious. Their contamination required divine intervention. Their judgment demonstrated both the reality of divine justice and the depths of divine mercy. In our next exploration, we'll discover how the flood that followed their rebellion wasn't just about destruction, but about the preservation of hope itself. We'll uncover why Noah's Ark contained more than just animals. It carried the genetic and spiritual integrity necessary for the Messiah's birth. We'll explore how every detail of the flood account points toward the ultimate cleansing that is yet to come. Because the waters of judgment that destroyed the corrupt world point toward the fire of purification that will birth the new creation. The preservation of the faithful few through the flood previews the gathering of all believers into eternal safety. The restoration that began after the flood points toward the complete renewal that will follow Christ's return. The watchers fell, but their fall revealed both the depth of the problem and the magnificence of the solution. Their rebellion demonstrated the reality of cosmic evil, but it also highlighted the necessity of divine intervention. Their corruption showed how far creation could fall, but it also revealed how high divine love would reach to accomplish redemption. Their story continues to unfold in every generation, in every human heart, in every choice between selfishness and service. But it will reach its final chapter when the one they opposed returns in glory to establish the kingdom they sought to usurp. Until that day, we live as witnesses to the truth they rejected, as guardians of the purity they corrupted, as bridges between the rebellion they introduced and the restoration that is coming. We carry within us the capacity for both their corruption and their redemption. The choice remains ours, as it remained theirs, as it remains for every being created with the terrible and wonderful gift of moral freedom. The Watchers chose desire over duty and nearly destroyed the world. The question that echoes through eternity is what we will choose when faced with the same fundamental decision between our will and God's will, between temporal pleasure and eternal purpose, between the seductive promise of becoming like gods and the humble calling to serve the one true God. Story forces most uncomfortable us to confront their truth about human nature and divine justice. Because when we trace the ripple effects of their rebellion through biblical history, we discover something that challenges everything's plan we think we know about Go for humanity. Consider this disturbing pattern. After the flood supposedly cleansed the earth of all corruption, the Nephilim immediately reappear in the biblical narrative. Not scattered individuals, but organized tribes with established territories and military structures. The Anakim in Canaan weren't just random giants. They were descendants of a systematic program of angelic human hybridization that had resumed almost immediately after the waters receded. Numbers Chapter 13 records the spies tear the inhabitants' report of the Promised Land. But notice what they specifically say about the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. This wasn't just about physical size. This was about beings who possessed such overwhelming supernatural presence that grown men felt like insects in their shadow. The Watchers fell because they believed love justified breaking every boundary God had established. Their story reveals that even beings with perfect knowledge, unlimited power, and direct access to divine presence can choose rebellion when desire overwhelms duty. They thought they were following their hearts, but they were actually following their destruction. What makes their fall so terrifying isn't just the cosmic devastation it unleashed. It's the mirror it holds up to every human soul. Because we face the same fundamental choice they faced every single day. The choice between our will and God's will. Between temporal pleasure and eternal purpose. Between the seductive whisper that we can be our own gods and the humble calling to serve the one true God. Their rebellion nearly destroyed the world, but it also revealed something magnificent about divine love. A love so pure it cannot tolerate corruption. So just it must judge rebellion. So merciful it provides redemption even in the midst of judgment. So powerful it can transform even cosmic treason into an opportunity for eternal glory. The patterns they established in the days before the flood are emerging again in our generation. The same forbidden knowledge being revealed prematurely. The same blurring of boundaries between natural and supernatural realms. the same promise of godlike power through technology and hidden wisdom. Jesus himself warned that as it was in the days of Noah, so it would be at the coming of the Son of Man. But their story also contains hope, because the same God who preserved Noah's family through the waters of judgment will preserve his people through the fire of purification that is coming. The corruption they introduced will finally be completely removed. The rebellion they began will forever end. And those who choose faithfulness over rebellion will inherit the kingdom they sought to steal. Next time, we'll dive into the great flood itself and discover why Noah's Ark wasn't just about saving animals, but about preserving something far more precious: the genetic and spiritual integrity necessary for the Messiah's birth. We'll uncover how every detail of that ancient catastrophe points toward the final cleansing described in Revelation, when God will make all things new. The Watchers fell for humanity, but their fall revealed humanity's desperate need for a Savior who would succeed where they failed. That Savior came, and he's coming again.